Hello, everyone. Welcome to this discussion. Before we start, I want to thank Brown University's Costs of War project at the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs for hosting this event. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. I'll introduce them one by one as we hear from them, and I want to thank you all for joining. My name is Matt Duss. I'm a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Previously, I was a foreign policy advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders. And I'll start my brief remarks here by quoting something that Senator Sanders often has said when he talks about issues of war and peace, and that is that wars have unintended consequences. Once a country undertakes to use violence to achieve its goals, it is impossible to see where that violence leads and the impacts that violence will have on people and communities far beyond just the strict theaters of war, and often those consequences are hidden, especially for Americans. A lot of the consequences and impacts of our foreign policy, particularly the use of military violence, is hidden from us here in the United States, protected as we are by the two oceans, and a news media which far too often does not pay enough attention to these impacts, moving on as if these wars are over. But unfortunately, as this excellent report makes clear, the impacts of our various post-9/11 wars, those impacts continue to be felt by communities around the world, also in the United States, particularly among veterans communities. But this report focuses on countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Somalia, whose people continue to endure the consequences of these wars. Here in the United States, we are complicit and give our consent to these acts of military violence. So it's extremely important for us to understand what is being done in our name and the consequences of those actions. So I see this report as a really, really valuable asset in putting a light on some of those consequences to enable us to have a more informed debate about the use of force and issues of war and peace going forward. So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce the writer of this report. Dr. Stephanie Savell is a public anthropologist who researches militarism, security, and civic engagement in relation to the United States post-9/11 wars. As co-director of the Costs of War project, she serves as editor of the project's research papers and executive director of operations. Dr. Savell's research has been widely featured in media outlets and academic journals. So, Stephanie, thank you for this work. I know it was painstaking and let's say a bit mentally and psychologically taxing. Working on these issues always is. But go ahead and just talk to us a bit about the report, and maybe you can talk about some of the things that you discovered, some of the key findings, and what you would like viewers and readers to take away from this work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. Thanks all of you for being here. As Matt said, this is not an easy topic. It's really emotionally, ethically, academically challenging, and so I really appreciate all of you, my fellow panelists and audience members, for being here today. Cost of War has been releasing regularly updated figures of the direct death toll in the post-9/11 wars for many years, and we've been wanting to do this overview of indirect deaths for a long time. Direct deaths are people who die by bombs and bullets and fire and all the kind of direct combat. Indirect deaths are through these other means, so I'm going to focus on that today. Wars contaminate the environment, they force people to leave their homes, they collapse economies, public services, and infrastructure. These consequences lead to mass impoverishment, loss of access to food and clean water, loss of healthcare, medicine, and other essential pathways to preserving health and life. These effects in turn lead to indirect war deaths, the large majority of which occur due to malnutrition, pregnancy and birth-related problems, and many illnesses, including infectious diseases, as well as diseases like cancer. Some also result from injuries due to war's destruction of infrastructure like traffic signals and from reverberating trauma and interpersonal violence. The Cost of War project looks in particular at the post-9/11 wars, the most violent wars in which the US government has been involved in the name of counterterrorism since 2001. These include US-led wars against militants in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, and they also include wars in which the US government has participated, intensifying the violence, such as with US Operation Inherent Resolve since 2014 in Iraq and Syria, as well as in Yemen, Libya, and Somalia. I do not focus on attributing responsibility to particular warring parties over others, or to disentangling various compounding factors, such as the actions of authoritarian governments, environmental disasters, or the accumulating devastations of prior wars. Rather than teasing apart who, what, or when is to blame, I focus on how the post-9/11 wars are implicated in many kinds of deaths. This project builds on the work of many scholars in the Cost of War network, and it was built through a community of researchers coming together through many conversations, building on many different people's insights and lots of research assistance. I pulled together research from many different fields, including public health research and UN reports. And I also interviewed a lot of experts for this paper. I'm an anthropologist, so I folded in conversations with anthropologists of the regions. And some of these topics are so challenging to study academically that the best data we can get is ethnographic, qualitative data that's based on deep insights into local people's lives. So I'm really grateful for all the experts that helped with this project. The bulk of the indirect death numbers come from the deaths of children under 5. They're the group that are most vulnerable to birth complications, malnutrition, and disease. So I calculated from various UN data sources that more than 7.6 million children under 5 are suffering from acute malnutrition, also known as wasting, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. And this makes them especially vulnerable to contracting infectious diseases. So one major point of my paper is that the reverberating impacts of war affect some people more intensely than others. Men are more likely to die in combat, but women and children are more often killed indirectly by wars. And people who live in rural areas are especially vulnerable when public services like healthcare are destroyed. Ultimately, the impacts of the ongoing war violence are so vast and so complex that they are unquantifiable. But an attempt to grasp the scale of the issue can help promote government accountability and reparations in the broadest sense to war zone populations. Past wars have shown that indirect deaths can number far higher than direct deaths. For instance, in the 1950s Korean War, of the 5 to 6 million people who died, only 15 to 20% were as a result of violence, and the great majority by starvation and other war-related causes. The field of estimating the numbers of indirect deaths has been evolving over the past 2 decades, and it's been complex and controversial, as has been the calculation of direct war deaths for that matter. Given the lack of specific data from each of the war zones, one of the best available methods we have is to use a ratio. And according to a pivotal study by the Geneva Declaration Secretariat in 2008, a reasonable conservative average estimate for any contemporary conflict is a ratio of 4 indirect deaths to 1 direct death. So I applied this ratio to cost of war's calculation of about 906,000 to 937,000 directly killed, which yields between 3.6 to 3.7 million deaths. Thus brings the total figure, including direct and indirect, to roughly 4.5 to 4.6 million total. The heart of my research laid out the various causal pathways, which is an epidemiological term for a long sequence of war's consequences, a pattern of suffering that can lead to death, disabilities, and other long-lasting physical and mental health conditions, including developmental disorders in children. I'm going to share my screen with you here, so bear with me just a moment. Okay. So this is an infographic that that shows the various causal pathways that I focus on in the paper. The first is economic collapse, loss of livelihood, and food insecurity, which has been devastating and widespread in the war zones. I'll focus on Afghanistan in particular, which is currently experiencing a humanitarian crisis. 95% of Afghans are not getting enough to eat, and in women-headed households, that number is 100%. Nearly half the country's population were acutely food insecure last year. Of these, 3.9 million children are wasting and 1 million children at risk of death. A particularly devastating and emblematic statistic: during the first 3 months of 2022, just 3 months, an estimated 1 in 10 newborn Afghan babies died. There's also the destruction of public services and health infrastructure. The destruction of healthcare has particularly far-reaching effects. And I'll just show my next slide here. And this slide really shows how these effects compound over time. So in the immediate term, a hospital may be bombed or closed or rendered ineffective by lack of electricity, healthcare workers forced to flee, supply chains of medicines disrupted. And then in the medium term, access to healthcare is limited, the quality of care decreases, healthcare workers are working without pay, performing tasks beyond their training, vaccines are disrupted, infectious diseases surge. In the long term, this increases maternal and newborn mortality, it increases disease-related deaths, and it has other population-level health effects. The destruction of other infrastructure has really significant negative health effects as well. For example, destruction of water and sanitation systems, roads, electrical systems, and commercial infrastructure like ports. At the height of the US-led war in Iraq, the disastrous state of roads and traffic systems led to as many, if not more, fatalities than the conflict itself. There's also environmental contamination. Bombs and other munitions contain heavy metals, white phosphorus, depleted uranium, and dioxin. They cause horrific injuries, but they also contaminate soil, water, and vegetation. Explosive weapons destroy buildings, releasing asbestos, industrial chemicals, fuels, and other hazards. And destroyed water and sanitation facilities lead to pollution from sewage. In rural areas, bombing disrupts agriculture, and unexploded remnants of war remain, injuring and killing people for years after the active fighting. Medical doctors in Iraq report an unusually high rate of miscarriages, premature births, and birth defects, including congenital anomalies such as cleft palates and spinal deformities. And 43-year-old Yasin Omar in Iraq says, "We often say that every family includes someone with cancer." Reverberating trauma and violence, living through war and forced displacement is traumatic, and it has long-lasting impacts on mental health, which can lead to suicide and increased domestic, sexual, and other kinds of interpersonal violence. Afghans told anthropologist Dr. Anila Deluxai, "I don't even taste food anymore. I wish this life would just end. I hit my child, she doesn't do anything wrong. Hopefully Allah will forgive me. There's something wrong with me," another man said. They knew what they were doing, but in the face of their PTSD, they felt helpless to stop their own violence against their families. Finally, internal displacement intensifies the negative health effects of all causal pathways. For example, worsening food insecurity and lack of access to healthcare, among other things. I'm going to stop sharing there. And I'd like to close by raising the issue of moral accountability. What responsibilities does the US have in the face of this suffering in post-9/11 war zones? Again, I've been very explicit. I'm not saying that the US is solely responsible for all of these deaths, but the US did choose to wage a war in response to 9/11, and it chose to continue that war endlessly. So what is the cost of that choice? What is US responsibility to people in the war zones in the face of that choice? And how can we make better choices in the future? I'll pass it on to the next person.
Definitely, thank you so much for that summation of the report. And I would encourage, really encourage viewers to read the report. There is a short summary of it, but also the longer report itself is very much worth reading. It's, again, really important work, and thank you for your effort. I'd like to turn to Ruba Ali Al-Hassani. Ruba is an interdisciplinary sociologist and a postdoctoral research fellow at Lancaster University's Department of Politics, Philosophy, and Religion. Her research focuses on Iraqi studies, law, transitional justice, crime, social control, and social movements. She co-founded the Canadian Association for Muslim Women in Law and the Iraqi Women Academics Network. Ruba, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for your work. Can I just start with a question? In your work focused on Iraq, what have you observed about how the impacts of war can last long after the war itself?
Thank you for the question. I'd like to share my screen as I begin talking, if that's okay. So the report itself has done such a wonderful job in discussing the various types of violence that continue after the waging of war itself. So there's, sorry, one moment. So there are different kinds of violence that are political and military. There's environmental violence, or as a causal pathway, there's economic violence. And my work focuses a lot on the epistemic, cultural, and psychological violence that continues after the launch of the invasion on Iraq. And lately, my work focuses on epistemic violence in particular. Since 2003, a lot has been written about Iraq, articles, books, reports, policy reports, etc. And much of this literature has painted Iraqis as either a passive polity that are subject to oppression by their own politicians, or an active polity that are a bunch of quote-unquote savages who are primordially and naturally violent, who are intent on killing each other and must be saved from each other, from themselves. And the narrative since 2003, and we just, basically past the 20-year mark of the invasion. So the timing of this event is very important. The narrative going on for the past 20 years has been Orientalist in nature, and it has pushed a sectarian narrative, and it has dehistoricized the outcomes of this war. So I'd like to address all of this briefly today. The Orientalist approach is part of a process where there's a certain will or intention to control and manipulate and incorporate a certain interpretation of events and dominate the conversation. So not only was the crime committed, which is the invasion and the war crimes and the crimes against humanity, but the intention is to dominate how the story is being told. And the way it's being told is that Iraqis, are lesser than, us here in the West, and we need to tell them what democracy is. We need to tell them who they are. And so there's this cumulative and corporative sort of consent amongst many media outlets and institutions that engage in this process actively. For example, there's the Abu Ghraib torture. The images came out in 2005. And I learned more recently that there was a musical about it some years ago in the US. And the question is, how can the narrative dehumanize people? You sing and dance about torture. And it just raises the question of how can you further dehumanize a people by doing this, for instance. The rhetoric has also been very sectarianizing in Iraq. And this is the part that has promoted a lot of violence and indirect deaths after the invasion. So sectarianism never emerges out of a vacuum. It is not primordial. It is a result of a process, an active one, shaped by political actors operating within specific contexts, pursuing political goals that involve the mobilization of popular sentiments around particular identities. And there are geopolitical rivalries and motivations behind this. And this sectarianization process is practiced by both Iraqi institutions and foreign intervention of various forms. And this sectarianization process has helped establish the ethno-sectarian consociational governing model in Iraq, which is also a party quota and an ethno-sectarian quota. So the president has to be of a certain ethnicity and faith, the prime minister, the minister of every cabinet minister. It is not a written law, but it is a common law that's being practiced. And this, although Iraq has had elections over the past few years, this quota overrides popular vote. So we end up having unelected officials in power, and they have been resilient in staying in power since. And they have been resilient with the support of armed groups that they have basically initiated or allied with. And these armed groups have thrived on the sectarianization process. They use the identity of us and them to attack each other. And when the US first invaded Iraq, its first two horrible mistakes was to dissolve the borders and to dissolve the or not necessarily dissolve the borders, but they dissolved the Iraqi army. So the borders were unprotected. Al-Qaeda was the first to come in, and other terrorist groups were formed. From 2006 to 2009, there was a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis on the basis of the sectarian rhetoric. And every Iraqi household has lost a loved one to this violence. I know I have. Al-Qaeda kidnapped one of my uncles. We've never seen him since. A cousin of mine was stabbed to death in front of her children. So these are among the many, many stories that many Iraqis of various backgrounds have experienced because of this process, the sectarianization of the story of Iraq since 2003. And this formation of armed groups has also been the result of not only sectarianization, but when the US invaded Iraq, it allowed other countries to get involved in Iraqi politics, such as Iran, for example. So it inevitably invited the other countries to get involved as well, rather heavily. So this all contributed to a militarization of society with the formation of armed groups. And as research has demonstrated, the militarization of society has contributed directly to domestic abuse. So women and children, again, are the greatest victims of these kinds of developments. And of course, there's a lot of trauma that takes place. I've interviewed people who have described the bombings that they have witnessed, the bodies that were strewn in the streets. So it just piled up trauma after trauma after trauma over the past few years. And the sectarianism has now taken over all levels of government, as well as the judiciary. And there is no outlet for Iraqis to escape this. And ISIS emerged before 2014, and I'm sure many people here know what happened, where many parts of Iraq were taken over by ISIS. There was a genocide against Yazidis. Many Yazidi women and children, over 2,000, are still missing today. And when it comes to the narrative, many countries want to claim the victory for themselves, but at the end of the day, it was the Iraqis who picked up arms and fought ISIS. They're the ones who made the ultimate sacrifices, yet there are many governments out there who will claim that they defeated ISIS instead of Iraq. And as a result of the sectarianization, this orientalization, this active discrimination, there has been a constant alienation between Iraqis and state institutions, as well as between Iraqis themselves of different various backgrounds. And in 2019, the Tishreen or October protest movement emerged, whose slogan was Nrid Watan, which means we want a homeland. And it speaks to this desire for belongingness. They wanted to belong not only to a country and form a new national identity that brings them together, but they wanted to actively belong to each other as a result of this entire sectarianization process. So Iraqis, by large numbers, the largest protest movement Iraq has seen in modern history, took to the streets calling for the dissolution of the ethno-sectarian consociational system. They calling for no longer pushing the sectarian rhetoric, calling for accountability of corruption and violence, among many other demands. Other demands were the separation of religion from state, calling on all countries to stop their interventions in Iraq, whether it was the US or Iran, because one brings the other. And there were many other demands as well. During the protest movement, the government at the time used, not only the government, but many armed groups that are not necessarily affiliated with the state, used various forms of violence to silence the protests. Amongst them were tear gas canisters that were used directly against protesters, piercing through their skulls, killing them on the spot. Armed groups also used snipers and live fire and forcible disappearances to silence protesters. And here are images of some prominent activists who were killed in these protest movements. And many foreign governments claimed support for protesters, but at the same time, they also held events inviting activists, posting their images on their websites as part of their events. And those images were used by armed groups to isolate and pinpoint those activists, target them, and assassinate them. So there's a whole dynamic going on. And when we talk about all this today, there's an active dehistoricization. So whenever corruption in Iraq is discussed, this is the only time when Iraqi agency is brought in, where people will say, oh, well, Iraqi officials are corrupt and that's their problem. But this is we have to historicize this and place it within the historical timeline of how this all came to be, how the sectarianism came to be, and how this violence came to be today. And the Tishreen or October protest movement continues till this day in various forms, not necessarily in street protest, but we're waiting to see what happens next in Iraq. Thank you.
Ruba, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. Before we move on, I just want to note to our audience, you can use the Q&A function to suggest questions for our panelists after the presentations have finished. Now I'd like to introduce Bonyan Gamal. Bonyan is a lawyer based in Sana'a, Yemen, and has been working with Mwatana for human rights for 8 years. She was an accountability and redress officer and a field researcher documenting human rights violations by all parties to the conflict, and in the legal support unit providing legal support for the victims of detention-related abuses in Yemen. She has worked on the arms trade, on U.S. drones operations and detentions, and promoting accountability for Yemen through the internet, through international legal action. She is now the director of the legal support unit at Mwatana. Bonyan will be speaking off camera. Her camera will be off. Don't worry, there's nothing wrong with the program. But I just want to take a brief moment here to note, I had the privilege of working with Senator Sanders over the years on a war powers resolution on Yemen as part of a larger effort to kind of bring attention to the war in Yemen and the United States' role in it. And we were really lucky to meet with representatives from Mwatana a number of times on Capitol Hill, and I know that their advocacy and their research made an enormous impact in the work that our office, Senator Sanders' office, and others, as well as the broader U.S. and international coalition around Yemen did. So I want to just acknowledge that. If I can ask, Bonyan, you've done quite a bit of work documenting how starvation has been used as a weapon of war in Yemen. What can you tell us about how you have observed the human impact of war, how it extends beyond the actual fighting?
Thank you, Matt. And I would like first to thank you all for organizing this event, and thank you for the great report, Stephanie. I think it was very important to talk about the not very direct impacts of war. If I can just give you a brief introduction on Mwatana's work in general, and maybe talk about starvation and drone attacks as an example for the lasting impacts of war, the indirect impacts of war. Of course, Mwatana documents human rights violations. We've been documenting them since 2011, but we've been officially registered since 2013. We've worked on documenting airstrikes, drone attacks, air raids and ground raids, detentions and violations that goes around detention facilities. And we are now at our 10th year in Mwatana, with the continuing documentation, but unfortunately not a lot of, we haven't been able to get results on direct accountability. The starvation report, or starvation in Yemen, is one of the indirect impacts of war, but it is also used as a weapon of war and has been used as a weapon of war in Yemen. We recently have worked on documenting drones attacks and ground raids. We have published 2 reports in that regard. In our last report, we documented 12 US operations. These happened between January 2017 and January 2019. In those operations, we documented 38 civilian loss, like 38 civilians who lost their lives. Among them were 13 children, 5 of them were under the age of 10, and 6 women. What we realized through that report, that losing their lives or losing lives wasn't the only impact, and we realized through the 2 years of research that there were more deep impacts that haunted the lives of these people throughout the years. Of course, I'm taking drones as an example, and I think the same goes to other violations happening in Yemen, like airstrikes, like detention, like torture, by all parties to this Yemeni conflict. So after documenting 12 incidents and analyzing the effects, after I think we conducted around 69 interviews, we realized that there are much more effects that happen to these people. I mean, I talked to families after 2 or 3 years of the incident itself, and we realized that they are still impacted. And if I can run you through the most, like the most dominating impacts, it was, the first one was their economical situation. These incidents and the several incidents in Yemen have led to adverse economic effects. For example, in most of the incidents, their families relied on their, haven't yet restored to provide for their families after losing their primary breadwinners. Another impact that affected their economical situation was that damaging and destroying and we used it to get water, food, and for transportation. There wasn't public transportations and there wasn't services. And they only had, for example, this car, and their homes were destroyed. Their livestock, which they depended at and after all these incidents, generally, and through drones, we realized that there wasn't really any kind of reparation to the victims, whether it's by the US government or the Yemeni government or any of the responsible parties. Another thing that we also realized through the research was that the operations caused very significant social and psychological effects. Some of the members that survived have left their homes. They couldn't stay in those areas. They were afraid. They were scared. They left their homes and staying in those areas because they were. Remember, in one of the interviews, there was a little child who said that I was afraid to go to the bathroom because I did not want I did not want the drone to hit while I was in the bathroom. He was actually afraid that his whole family will die and he will live. That was one of the interviews that really affected me. Another thing that we realized from all the interviews was that there is a feeling of resentment, anger, and helplessness that we felt throughout the interviews. It was the same, more or less. And that goes not just through drones, but generally. I mean, I know that the effects of this war is affecting maybe almost everyone in Yemen indirectly. And it is also affecting people who are living outside Yemen, who are in safe places and in kind of good economical situations, but they are still struggling psychologically. They are in constant fear, they are in constant worry about their family, and this feeling of resentment and anger also reaches them because it is now maybe 8 years of conflict with no real accountability, no real criminal accountability. Another thing is I mean, if we mention accountability as the only way to be able to overcome these kinds of effects of war is some kind of accountability. I mean, in the drones research, we worked in tribal areas where deaths happen, conflict happens internally, but they are also resolved in some cases tribally. Like in some cases, a simple apology, or we call it tahkim, might solve a criminal death case. But in these cases, whether it's the drones or the airstrikes or the detentions, there wasn't even a real sort of apology. There was no sort of reparation. And this also led to having this constant feeling of anger. Going back to the drones research, we tried to research what is the best way that we can get these victims to some sort of accountability or reparations. So we tried to contact the US military. We tried, with the help of Columbia Law School, we tried to contact the US military. First of all, Yemenis in this conflict does not have real passages, real tunnels to accountability. We have no way. Hello?
Hello, please go ahead.
Yes, okay. I'm sorry, the internet got disconnected. Where did you lose me?
I think you were talking about accountability, which is actually where I wanted to go with a question. So maybe we could start here, but then I'll go to the panelists. From our Q&A, Dr. Hatem Bazian asks that question: what do communities that have been affected, that have been impacted by these wars, have any legal recourse for the harm caused? You know, and what would accountability look like? I guess we could start with you, Bonyan, but then I would love to move on to Ruba and Stephanie as well.
Yeah, this is where I was also forced. And for the drones research, for the drones accountability research, we had to rely on very wide research and rely also on the accountability, on the research of Columbia Law School to understand where can we go to inform the US government of these incidents, and also file some sort of legal action. And that is a lot. I mean, we are okay, an organization who has some sort of resource, and we were able to do that. But thinking of the hundreds and thousands and maybe millions of victims throughout Yemen, there is no way for them to find out that, okay, you can send a letter to the US military, and what does this letter have to contain for the US military to actually respond to you. And this is, I'm taking the drones and the US military as an example. When talking about accountability, the international legal system gives the Yemenis no way to file any kind of criminal accountability. And that's why Mwatana has been pushing for criminal international mechanism to be established. But until now, until 8 years through conflict, and instead of creating a stronger mechanism, the UN Human Rights Council canceled the GEE, the groups of eminent experts. Anyway, we sent a letter to the US military. It was 150 pages, and it had a lot of information about 12 incidents. Unfortunately, we did not. We got correspondence. We got some replies, and we corresponded with the US military, with the Central Command, but unfortunately, there was no action. Nothing happened. The US later on, they acknowledged one incident that happened in 2019, and in that incident, they said that they will not even pay ex gratia payments, which was very disappointing, because when I called the families and said, okay, the US acknowledged that this was a civilian death, they said, and nothing. So there was no kind,
Yeah.
there wasn't any kind of apology, any kind of way that helps the family to get any kind of transitional justice.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you very much. I would just like to move to Ruba. I mean, Ruba, if you would like to address that in Iraq, but also another question related to the impacts of the wars, if you could just talk a little bit about, how the impacts of the war in Iraq, the US war in Iraq, has interacted with climate change to create much worse consequences.
Yes, I'd like to answer this just after quickly addressing the legal recourse
Thank you.
question, because there's a history of it in the Iraqi context. With the Abu Ghraib cases of torture, for example, there has been a legal process in the US. However, no one was truly held accountable. Out of a number of people who were responsible for the torture, only one was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and he only served 5 years for good behavior, even though he himself had a history of torturing American inmates before being deployed to fighting in Iraq. So there's a cycle of violence that's being perpetuated. And I would like to invite everyone who's listening today to realize that violence on US soil is not divorced from violence in the military-industrial complex in other countries. There have been other attempts to hold people accountable for the rape of Sabrina Janabi, a 14-year-old girl by US soldiers who killed her family, raped and then killed her. And again, no one was held accountable. A US court acquitted them all. There was also the case of Blackwater mercenary fighters who killed at least 20 Iraqis in a public square, in the Sur Square. And again, Blackwater is, it's a very different territory because they're not counted as US combatants. So they receive special treatment. Again, no one was held accountable. And the US is not a signatory of the Roma Statute. So you cannot take the US to court in the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So that prevents any sort of accountability. One can see that there are cases of universal jurisdiction used in Germany and France to hold Syrian officials accountable for torture of Syrian civilians. Seeing those cases, one wonders why this universal jurisdiction is not used against US officials. There's always a resistance to hold the US accountable for what it has done in Iraq, because that would open the door to US crimes in many other countries, as this report and many other projects cover. As for the impact of the war on climate change in Iraq, it has exponentially sped up the desertification of Iraq. The marshlands in the south are drying up very, very fast. It's actually quite frightening. These are the marshlands that many historians have theorized are the Garden of Eden. They have a diverse, there's great biodiversity there that's dying very quickly. It's a catastrophe taking place. The warfare that shook the soil in Iraq has released the biotoxins from Saddam's regime that it used. It is also causing much pollution in Iraq. So there are many sandstorms that are taking place more and more intensely, which impacts many people with respiratory problems. And even those who didn't have them now have them. There's also the oil fields and the flaring of gas that also pollute areas, and the report, Stephanie's report addresses this as well. Gayara near Mosul is mentioned in the report, which was basically suffering of great pollution. And all this pollution has spiked the cases of cancer in Basra in particular. One person in Basra tried to take BP into court recently, but he died right before he was supposed to give his testimony. It's like an epidemic, a cancer in Basra in the south. There are also continuing births with congenital birth defects in Fallujah, for example, as a result of depleted uranium used by US forces, and white phosphorus. White phosphorus is an illegal weapon of war.
Thank you, Ruba. If I could turn to Stephanie. Stephanie, you made there was a good Washington Post piece looking at the report, and I think it ended with a really important question from you, which is, how do we come to terms with a sense of responsibility in the United States? What is that responsibility? What can we do? What must we do? And where, as Americans who are, obviously implicated in these consequences, where do we make that demand?
Yeah, I still have a lot of learning to do, honestly, to think about reparations in the sense of the term that I want to talk about it, which is, I just the work that Ruba was describing with holding particular officials accountable, the work that Mwatana does, in terms of writing these letters to the U.S. military and claiming a certain level of responsibility there. They're so essential and important, and I don't want to detract from that. But I would like to push the public conversation in the United States further than a question of holding particular officials accountable. I would like to look at this as a structural issue. I would like us to ask questions and talk about, what is the role of U.S. war in what I'm trying to say is, I was looking at polling this morning that says that most in the U.S. agree that we should pursue diplomacy rather than war. Right, 54.5%. So a slight majority of US adults agree that US should pursue non-military responses to conflict. So how does that translate into the actual actions of the US government? And how does it, how can we as kind of regular Americans hold our government accountable for the fact that the military-industrial complex is kind of dictating the course of US foreign policy and emphasizing a militarization when actually a slight majority of Americans doesn't want that to be so. We would rather there be other diplomatic, non-militarized alternatives. Right. So how do we bring that into being as a society? How do we get rid of this pedestal that Pentagon spending is on, right? How do we recalibrate a budget so that actually other sectors of U.S. foreign relations can also have a role to play, not just the military, right? So let's think about this in a kind of big picture, critical thinking sense more than we do. And let's hold our officials accountable for the damage that we've caused in a much broader level. And, as Bonyan was pointing out, there's so much anger in these war zones, right? This is strategic as well as moral, what I'm talking about, right? I've done research on the ground in West Africa, and there I saw that the violent crackdown of the government against particular ethnic groups in the name of counterterrorism is fueling the violence. It's recruiting people to these militant movements. So there's very much a strategic sense in which waging war on terror, waging a war in general, is not the most effective way of generating the kinds of solutions and avenues for future that we want, right? So I think that's where the Cost of War Project is really trying to push as a nation, kind of push greater critical thinking, critical questioning, and holding officials accountable for structural decision-making on a broader level.
Thank you. And we just have a few minutes left. I'd like to just go to Ruba and then Bonyan for some very brief final remarks, maybe just 1 or 2 minutes each. Just what, speaking mainly to Americans here from countries and representing communities that have been affected by U.S. wars. I mean, what are the main ideas you would like our viewers to come away from this conversation with today? Ruba, we'll go to you first.
Yes, I would invite every American listening to this conversation to fight for their education system. There's a war on the education system in the US against critical education in some states, and some theories that are being banned from being taught are actually quite crucial to the understanding of inequalities both in the US and on the world stage. So I would say fight for your education system. When a government prioritizes the military over education, or over healthcare systems, then you need to question its intentions towards its own people, not just the world stage. So I invite you to defend your education system, because that's where all critical thinking emerges, hopefully.
Thank you. Bonyan, to you, please.
Yeah, just a big thank you again to you all, and for Stephanie for the great report. I just want to say that the US government can do much more as a positive role to end the war in Yemen, not just stop participating in it, whether it's through drones or through arms sales, but the US has the power to play a very positive role in creating peace in Yemen. And honestly, with the Biden administration, there was a lot of promises regarding the war in Yemen, regarding the end of the arms trade. But until now, this is not really happening. So I'm hoping that people listening would be able to push for the US government to do that.
All right, thank you, Bonyan. Did you have any last remarks, Stephanie?
No, just thanks so much again, Matt and Bonyan and Ruba. Just it's been wonderful to have this conversation with you and our audience members for being here. It's a tough topic once again, and I'm glad we've been able to talk about this.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just very briefly to wrap up here. I want to thank the Cost of War Project for their years of fantastic work on these issues. I know that in the Senate, we always paid close attention to the materials that were produced. I know a lot of people did who we worked with. Stephanie, I want to thank you for your amazing work on this document, on this really important research. Ruba and Bonyan, thank you for taking the time to be with us, and thank you for your amazing ongoing research and scholarship. As I said at the beginning, these are difficult issues to work on, and I just want to note that. So I want to say what an enormous privilege it has been to be with you here today, to be able to talk about these ideas. And I want to thank all our viewers for taking the time to be with us too. I would encourage you to look at the links and read the report and follow up on the work of each of our panelists. And thank you again. Have a great day.